Hello, everyone. So today I'll be talking about our work on a study on the life cycle of flaky tests. My name is Wing. This work was done in collaboration with some folks from Microsoft, specifically Kavan, Hitesh, and Suresh. So what is a flaky test? A flaky test is essentially a test that passes and fails when you run it in the same test scenario. On the right-hand side of the slide here, we actually have a flaky test from a Microsoft product. This test actually, by itself, contains over 100 lines of code in this test class just by itself. And when the problem with this test is that at line 20, we would find that it can actually pass and fail. And so immediately, it's not exactly clear why this might be the case. So in order to understand this, let's kind of walk through the test a bit together. You can see actually that at lines 3 to 4, we're actually setting up a database. Around lines 6 to 8, we're actually adding some content to the database. And at line 10, we shut down the database. And then at line 13, we actually have this thread.sleep here. So essentially, we're waiting for something, but it's a little unclear immediately what this might be. And we'll revisit this once we actually go over the rest of the tests. At lines 14 to 15, we see that we're actually ensuring some file reader is actually killed before we start using it. And then at lines 17 to 20, we use the file reader and check whether or not some expected content was logged into some file. Still, again, at this point of the code, it's unclear why the expected content is missing sometimes. And it turns out, actually, it's very much related to line 13. In fact, what line 13 was meant for is actually to wait for some added content to be logged into the trace file. So as database executes, it actually will log some content into a trace file asynchronously. And then lines 17 to 20 checks whether or not some content was logged. In fact, when we actually see what the developers fix to kind of reduce the flakiness of this test, they actually suggest increasing the sleep time. Specifically, we see the developers change line 13 from 300 to 600. And the developer themselves even made a comment saying that they are fixing this flakiness by increasing the wait time before they check for the content. So some previous researchers who worked on flaky tests would actually categorize this as an async wait flaky test. Essentially, a test that makes an asynchronous call but does not properly wait for the call to return before they start utilizing its resources. In general, though, flaky tests of all kinds, including these async wait ones, are problematic for various reasons. And that includes wasting the developer's time in the sense that if a developer makes some recent change and a flaky test fails, they may think actually that it's because of their recent change. And because of that, they may spend time manually debugging a non-existent fault in their recent changes. And also just wasting machine resources to rerun the tests. So the goal of our work is actually to help these proprietary software developers with flaky tests. And we accomplish this by first performing a study that helps characterize flaky tests in these proprietary software. We then proceed to introduce an approach to help balance the runtime and frequency of flaky test failures caused specifically by asynchronous calls. In terms of our study, we actually look at 5 main categories of questions. The first one is on the idea of prevalence. So how prevalent flaky tests are and how they really impact the developer's workflow. The second one is on detectability. How many runs, I guess, are typically needed in order to detect flaky tests? The third one is on characteristics. So does test flakiness actually ever reoccur after developers fix them? How does the runtime of flaky tests sort of differ on passing and failing runs? And the fourth category that we looked at is actually on the categories of flaky test fixes themselves, specifically the root cause and location of these flaky test fixes. And finally, we take a look at the resolution of flaky tests. So how much time do developers take to actually fix these flaky tests, and how developers are fixing a specific type of these flaky tests. For the purpose of my presentation today, I'll focus largely just on the categories and resolution question. Specifically for categories, we see that the majority of the fixes for flaky tests are actually in the test code. We also see that the most common category of flaky test fixes is this async wait related category, where again, a flaky test makes an asynchronous call and doesn't properly wait for the call to return. And our findings here actually confirms what a previous study on flaky tests has found, specifically that test code is where the majority of the fixes are typically made, and async wait is the most common category. In terms of how developers are currently fixing flaky tests, specifically the async wait ones, we have actually seen that some people have proposed 3 different ways to actually address these issues. The first one is to create these synchronous interfaces. And the second one is to implement callback. And the third one is to implement polling. So at Microsoft, we actually see a number of developers implement callbacks and polling. Besides what was proposed, we actually observed 3 other ways that developers at Microsoft have been fixing these async wait related flaky tests. Specifically, we see developers increase the wait and timeout, sort of like the example I gave earlier. Another way is that the developers will remove some code that's related to the async wait call, either directly removing that call or just removing the test itself. And the third one is actually to mock these asynchronous calls. The one thing I would draw your attention to here, though, is that the most popular way that developers seem to prefer fixing these tests is actually just to increase the wait and timeout. Because of this, so now we have seen that the majority of these flaky tests are actually of the async wait category, and the majority of how developers prefer to fix them is to increase the wait and timeout. The goal of our approach is actually to automatically suggest some time values that developers should wait for these asynchronous calls, while at the same time minimizing the rate of flaky test failure and the test runtime. The way our approach works is done in 2 main steps. The first one is to obtain the flaky test failure rate for the time value set by the developer to sort of establish a baseline for what the flaky test failure rate currently is and what the test's runtime currently is. We then generate new time values based on the previous time values, flaky test failure rate, and the runtime of the test then. Specifically for our approach, we actually take as an input a flaky test along with its dependencies. So whatever we need in order to actually run the flaky test. We take the number of runs to measure the frequency of flaky test failures and the number of time values to try. And so in this example here, what we would do is we would actually run the test 100 times using the time value specified by the developer to obtain the flaky test failure rate and the runtime. We would then use that to generate a new time value based on the previous time values, flaky test failure rate, and runtime. So for an example, if the previous time value was set to be 300 milliseconds, and we find that the flaky test failure rate is 0, then the next time value we would try would be 150 milliseconds, essentially binary searching our way to the next time value. In the end, we would, for each of the time values we would try, we would output that time value along with the runtime of the test and the flaky test failure rate. When we actually apply our approach to 5 different async wait fixes of developers, we actually see that our approach can help reduce the running time of these tests on average by 38%. And we also see that for one of the tests, we can actually reduce it by up to 78%. And for 4 out of 5 of these tests, we actually see that once we change these time values, the flaky test failure rate isn't affected much, actually. In the sense that we can keep decreasing the time it takes to run the test, but the flaky test failure rate is actually not affected. So, and especially once we study the manual investigation, we actually, especially once we perform a manual investigation on the fix, we actually see that developers really thought that changing the time value would have fixed the flaky tests or reduced at least the flaky test failure rate. In conclusion, we see that detecting flakiness is still very challenging. What developers claim as fixes are still often unreliable, and that async wait is one of the most common category of flaky tests in both open source and proprietary software. To help developers with this, we actually help by performing a study characterizing flaky tests and an approach to help them balance the runtime and frequency of their flaky test failures. Thanks. I'll take any questions at this point.